By 1856, Ticknor and Fields were the official American publishers of Alfred Lord Tennyson, for example, and each edition of Tennyson's work included a quote from a letter from the poet acknowledging that Ticknor and Fields alone were authorized to print his works in the United States. I hope you're seeing that Fields did whatever it took to urge his writers to work hard, sometimes going too far.
If there's anybody who's more than qualified to talk about Ticknor and Fields, it's our speaker. Rob Velella is a literary historian who focuses on American writing in the context of the 19th century. He has published articles and essays on a diverse range of American writers, including Margaret Fuller, Rufus Griswold, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Walt Whitman, and Edgar Allan Poe. He served as guest curator for an exhibition on Margaret Fuller at Harvard University's Houghton Library, and he assisted with an exhibit on Edgar Allan Poe at the Boston Public Library. He was a trustee of the organization that installed the statue of Poe near his Boston birthplace in 2014. Over the years, he has served as a public lecturer, a performer, and a tour guide. Most notably, he was an NPS ranger at the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow House in Cambridge for several years. And as always, he is hoping to bring American writing of the past back to the readers of today. Today, he will be speaking on the legacy of the publishers Ticknor and Fields in the Old Corner Bookstore. And I would like to present Rob Velella.
So we're going to talk about Ticknor and Fields, and just to start with, for those of you that didn't already know this, you're right across the street from their former headquarters, and we'll talk a little bit about how it changed over time as we're going along. Let's start with the term American Renaissance, a term that was coined in the 1940s as a reference to the period in United States literature that saw a blossoming of important writings and writers. It was an era where books became associated with a national identity, where certain specific writers began shaping the legends of our relatively new country. Names like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Henry David Thoreau became iconic, and their work came to represent the United States as a whole. At the center of it all was an old corner bookstore in Boston. The building, which still stands at the corner of Washington and School Streets, dates to the year 1711, but it did not become a bookstore until 1828 under a company named Carter and Hendy. And 5 years later, a publisher named William Davis Ticknor began leasing the space. And there he is. Ticknor was born in a town called Lebanon in New Hampshire. He was the oldest of 9 children. Ticknor was about 22 years old when he partnered with a man named John Allen to form the book-selling house of Allen and Ticknor. He had no previous experience in the book industry. About a year later, Allen left the business, and Ticknor ran things on his own under the name William D Ticknor and Company. And that'll give you an idea of the important works that William D Ticknor and Company was publishing. In the beginning, Ticknor and Company was mostly a bookstore, but it was also a publisher, sort of. You have to picture this early version of being a publisher as something more of a print on demand, or maybe like a Kinko's. Like most printers of the time, they did small jobs like stationery, calling cards, pamphlets, and self-published books, usually in small quantities. One of those books, paid for at the personal expense of the author, was called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans by Lydia Maria Child in 1833. It's believed to be one of the first significant books to speak out against slavery. This was good timing for William Ticknor. It was the beginning of a boom in the industry, where access to materials, advancements in technology, growing literacy rates, and even good postage all combined to mark the importance of printing, particularly in the medium of periodicals. Ticknor and Company printed those as well, but they weren't really a publisher yet. They were a printer. And actually, in the beginning, their main role was as a retailer, selling books, like the name Old Corner Bookstore implies. But many of those books were inconsequential, and certainly not great works of literature, with very few exceptions. The company almost didn't survive amidst the economic turmoil of the 1830s. In November 1835, Ticknor had to turn over some of his assets to pay off creditors, and he had to cease operations for a few months. In 1837, the year of a famous bank panic, he did not publish a single book. Eventually, he brought in another investor named John Reed Jr. That decade of the 1830s, in general, the printers focused not on literature like poetry, but on children's books and religious pamphlets. In inheriting the Old Corner Bookstore from the previous owners, however, William Ticknor also inherited a very important asset, a precocious teenager named James T. Fields. Fields had started working with the first bookstore at the Old Corner when he was 14. Yes, that's true, really, when he was 14 years old. Born in New Hampshire like Ticknor, he lost his father at 3 years old. In 1831, he was in Boston working with the printers Carter and Hendy at the Old Corner. He later frequently said, this is Fields, said he chose to go into a bookshop for work because he thought he could sit behind the counter and read all day. But the first thing he was told was that he was not allowed to read during business hours. As it turns out, his childhood interest in books made him a really good bookseller. He had a power, his colleagues said, of seeing a person enter the shop and predicting what book was wanted before the wish was expressed, and he seldom made a miss. Not bad for a salesman. By 1839, at 22 years old, he was already junior partner under William Ticknor. Ticknor was the businessman, and Fields was the literary man, the talent scout, the schmoozer. We'll talk more about that. Ticknor knew business, but Fields knew books, and the combination worked. Eventually. We have to remember that this was very early in the United States history, and the nation was still in its infancy. Although the 13 colonies had declared independence in 1776, the fact is that the United States remained dependent on Europe in economy and in culture. And this was true for literary culture, too. Although early Americans had a flourishing newspaper industry, and early American writing produced some great political or religious essays and early histories and biographies, American fiction was slow to develop. The argument had been that a nation and its people needed a long tradition of storytelling before fiction could draw from it seriously. Most famously, and if you've heard some of my talks before, I bring this one up a lot. Most famously, in 1820, a British critic named Sidney Smith wrote, "The Americans are a brave, industrious, and acute people, but they have hitherto given no indication of genius. In the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at American pictures or statues?" Well, as such, American readers looking for quality fiction turned to European authors. The country was too young and had no stories to tell, or at least that was the argument. Plus, the country was still trying to figure out what it was and how it would survive, politically, economically, practically, but not in a cultural sense. As such, the expectation among American readers was that quality literature had to come from abroad. And Ticknor and Fields took advantage of that market, of course, by reprinting the works of European authors. But the book industry was growing rapidly. In 1820, the year that Smith offered this wonderful quote, the US book industry was worth $2.5 million. It would grow to $12.5 million in the next 30 years. With this, technology was rapidly improving, everything from the way ink was produced, to how paper was rolled, to how illustrations were added, to the machinery that actually did the printing. And literacy was increasing exponentially. By 1860, between 91 and 93% of white Americans were literate. And this made up the largest potential reading audience in American history up to that point. By the 1840s, the Old Corner Bookstore was publishing more than just British reprints. It also included books by, for example, Massachusetts writers John Greenleaf Whittier, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. By 1843, they were also offering something called royalties to its authors, a first in the United States. For his poetry collection, Lays of My Home, author John Greenleaf Whittier was offered 10% off the book's sales, and that number eventually became a standard price. By 1849, the imprint housed at the Old Corner Bookstore was renamed Ticknor and Fields. Eventually, for a time, they created a standardized cover for their books. And for those of you that indulge in the very dangerous habit of collecting antique books, you know this. The design was meant to represent right away, this is Ticknor and Fields. If you don't know it, it's a really beautiful patterned chocolate brown cover with a recognizable font, usually in gold on the spine. More than just uniformity, the design assured readers that this book met the quality standards of Ticknor and Fields, and that the text needed no gimmicks to stand out. By the 1850s, they were also publishing fancier, collectible editions bound in blue cloth with gold edges, the so-called blue and gold editions. Or sometimes they produced inexpensive pocket editions for those who could not afford the fancy versions. Within the pages, too, books published by Ticknor and Fields often also included listings of their other publications, including upcoming publications, to help advertise and promote their other assets. This is a really early version of book publicity that no one else was really doing. What made them different as a company, too, was that they were interested in cultivating good literature, not just turning a profit. To do this, Ticknor and especially Fields worked hard to befriend their authors and support them in a more personal way. And I think we can thank James Fields in particular for being successful on that front. As one friend wrote about him, "Of warm friends and familiar acquaintances, probably no man ever living in Boston had a greater number. He made friends facile as a conjurer, with an almost dangerous ease. Wherever he went was geniality. I could not understand how it was possible for one man to carry so many intimacies." Fields had an office in the Old Corner that was separated from the shop by a green curtain. And there are many accounts of that green curtain and that at any time could be drawn open to reveal some really interesting surprise, probably one of the greatest literary lights of the generation. And that fact drew customers to the corner just as much as the books themselves. At any given time, if you went to go shopping at the Old Corner Bookstore, you never know. Ralph Waldo Emerson might actually be there. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow might actually be there. And some said, this was happened so often, some said with some exaggeration that, quote, all Boston may be said to pass through the Old Corner Bookstore in a day. And as one writer recalled, this is a long quote, but I think it really gives an idea of how people felt here. The annals of publishing and the traditions of publishers in this country will always mention the Little Corner Bookstore in Boston as you turn out of Washington Street into School Street. And those who recall it in other days will always remember the Curtin Desk at which poet and philosopher and historian and divine and the doubting, timid young author were sure to see the bright face and to hear the hearty welcome of James T. Fields. What a crowded, busy shop it was, with the shelves full of books and piles of books upon the counters and tables, and loiterers tasting them with their eyes and turning the glossy new pages, loiterers at whom you looked curiously, suspecting them to be the makers of books as well as readers. You knew that you might be seeing there in the flesh and in common clothes the famous men and women whose genius and skill made the old world a new world for everyone upon whom their spell lay. Suddenly, from behind the green curtain came a ripple of laughter, then a burst, a chorus, gay voices of two or three more, but always of one, the one who sat at the desk and whose place was behind the curtain, the literary partner of the house, the friend of the celebrated circle which has made Boston of the middle of the century justly renowned. For his own part, Fields loved being at the center of the growing literary culture of New England. Years later, he reflected on the many conversations he would share throughout his days with authors. As he wrote, "To converse with them and of them is one of the delights of existence, and I am never tired of answering questions about them or gossiping of my own free will as to their everyday life and manners." If you get a chance to read through any of the surviving letters that James T. Fields wrote to absolutely anyone, he is gossiping a lot about authors. This positive outlook was an important aspect of the business of Ticknor and Fields. It was easy for authors to have negative experiences with their publishers or the publishing industry in general at the time. Take, for example, and I have to say him, Edgar Allan Poe, whose first book, Tamburlaine and Other Poems, was published right here in Boston in 1827 at his own expense. We believe that he could only afford 50 copies to be printed. Only a few copies remain today, and it's now considered one of the rarest first editions in American literature. For example, one copy in 2009 sold for $662,500 at auction. But in 1827, no one bought it, and only one or two book catalogs even mentioned that it existed. Let's fast forward to more than 20 years later and focus on another up-and-coming writer who would become more appreciated after his death. Some of you will know him. Henry David Thoreau. You recognized him right away, right? Thoreau had been shopping around a manuscript based on his personal experiences and observations of nature. The book, based on an excursion with his brother, was called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Ticknor and Fields, of course, rejected it. But then they asked if Thoreau would pay for the printing costs out of pocket. $450 for 1,000 copies. $450. Of course, Thoreau couldn't pay. So he turned to a publisher named James Monroe. Monroe offered to pay for the printing of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, but he wanted to take that cost out of the profits from the book before Thoreau ever received any profit. If the book didn't sell, Monroe warned, Thoreau would have to reimburse them for the expense. Well, Thoreau's friend and mentor and teacher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, had published with that same company, and he had done well. So Thoreau gave it a shot. The book was published in May 1849, but the problem was James Monroe. As one recent biographer of Thoreau noted, Monroe didn't publish books, he printed them. Monroe had no distribution system, he did not assist in getting critics to publish reviews, and he certainly did not otherwise promote or advertise the book in any way. Like self-published authors today, it was up to Thoreau to get people to buy his book. But Thoreau was not well known or well connected, and A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers was a personal and professional failure for him. Less than 20% of the copies were sold, and it took Thoreau 4 years to pay off the cost to print it. And of course, famously, in October of 1853, when he received back all those unsold copies of his book from Monroe, Thoreau bitterly wrote in his journal, October 28, 1853, "I have now a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. This is authorship," he added. Thoreau had slightly better luck with his book, Walden, which was inspired by his time living alone at Walden Pond in Concord. He spent about 4 times as much time thinking about the book and writing the book as he did living at Walden Pond. It started off in pieces that Thoreau presented as lectures before going through several drafts in book form. 2,000 copies of Walden, or Life in the Woods, were finally published in August 1854 by Ticknor and Fields. It took years to sell out that first edition, but the book was apparently quite positively received. Emerson wrote that all American kind are delighted with Walden, as far as they have dared to say. But in 1861, an admirer from New Hampshire wrote to Thoreau asking for a copy of Walden. Thoreau responded he didn't have any, but he had plenty of a week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers. He would happily send one of those for $1.75. Excuse me, $1.25. I don't want to exaggerate his cost. He always smells of the pine woods. That's how James T. Fields referred to Henry David Thoreau. He always smells of the pine woods. As Thoreau neared his death, Fields asked him to revise some of his essays for publication in the Atlantic Monthly, which was by then owned by Ticknor and Fields. Thoreau agreed under condition that, quote, no sentiment or sentence be altered or omitted without my consent. This request was based on frustrations from previous editors and publishers. Ticknor, and also because Fields was known for altering people's work without asking for consent. Ticknor, not Fields, but Ticknor also visited Thoreau in his final days and asked if he could acquire the rights to all of his previous works in the hopes that their publishing house could put out a fancy uniform edition of the collected works of Thoreau. Fields is partly responsible for kickstarting that so-called American Renaissance in literature. But I want to mention that this era identified as a Renaissance is somewhat cherry-picked because it focuses on a very select group of writers, mostly male, very white writers, and centers much of that literature in New England. But I always like to assure people, especially New England people, there was literature outside of New England in this period. The term of the American Renaissance was first coined in 1941 by a scholar who believed that the authors he was putting together best represented the literature of democracy. The call to break away from British traditions dated earlier from people like Emerson, who called for a distinctly American literature free from the courtly muses of Europe in his American Scholar speech in 1837. And scholars credit Emerson directly for starting the movement with his 1850 book, Representative Men, not published by Ticknor and Fields. But Ticknor and Fields did play their part in the American Renaissance because that same year, 1850, they published another book, not just Walden. 4 years before Walden, they published a little book called The Scarlet Letter. And here's James T. Fields, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and William Ticknor. Fields actually claimed a fairly large amount of responsibility in inspiring Hawthorne's masterpiece, The Scarlet Letter. Most of Hawthorne's early literary career was a failure, with short stories published in poorly circulated magazines and annual gift books, many of which never paid him, most of which never put his name on them. Many of his stories were published anonymously, and the author complained he was the most obscure man of letters in America. In 1849, amidst the political controversy over Hawthorne's removal from his job in the Salem Custom House, Fields traveled to Salem to meet him. Fields asked Hawthorne if he had been able to write anything during his time at the Custom House. Hawthorne said he hadn't. The job dulled away his creativity, he said. And further, he asked, quote, who would risk publishing a book for me, the most unpopular writer in America? I would, Fields responded, and offered a minimum print run of 2,000 copies of whatever he had. Hawthorne insisted, however, he had nothing. But as Fields turned to leave, Hawthorne offered him a manuscript which he said was, quote, either very good or very bad, I don't know which. Fields read the manuscript beginning on the train ride home to Boston. He took the first train the next morning to Salem because he had just read The Scarlet Letter and wanted to publish it immediately. He offered an impressive print run, first print run, not of 2,000 like he originally said, but 2,500. And he offered a higher than average 15% royalty. It was extremely successful. A second edition was called for only 2 weeks after the first. It was Hawthorne's first novel as a mature writer, and it was Fields that made it happen. According to James T. Fields, anyway. Hawthorne's wife, Sophia Peabody, would later dispute how large a role Fields played. Either way, Fields was certainly a catalyst to several authors over the years. And both Fields and Ticknor were both important sources of encouragement, specifically to Hawthorne. As you can see in that previous photo, there they are, trying to make him happy. And this is a very rare, the Hawthorne experts will know this, a very rare instance of Hawthorne smiling. Slightly, very slightly. So both Ticknor and Fields really did try to encourage Hawthorne as much as they could. Hawthorne frequently suffered from writer's block and questioned his own literary worth. To Fields, he once noted, "I care more for your good opinion than for that of a host of critics, and have excellent reason for so doing, inasmuch as my literary success, whatever it has been or may be, is the result of my connection to you." As glowing as this praise is, Hawthorne actually was more personally loyal to William Ticknor. Ticknor was only 4 years younger than Hawthorne, compared to the 13-year difference with the much younger Fields. During the Civil War, Hawthorne asked Ticknor to accompany him to Washington, D.C., to see the effects of the war firsthand. The trip inspired the essay Chiefly About War Matters, which James T. Fields printed in the Atlantic Monthly, which he was then editing. But Fields probably is the one that censored the essay. Among Fields' complaints was Hawthorne's description of President Abraham Lincoln, who Hawthorne referred to using terms like coarse, sly, and queer. Terms of endearment in context, but Fields worried how people would respond to criticism of the president during wartime. Hawthorne agreed to the changes, but privately complained, writing, "What a terrible thing it is to try to let off a little bit of truth into this miserable humbug of a world." Hawthorne ends up adding these very sassy footnotes, which may or may not have been by the editor, or at least meant to be perceived as the editor, very sassy footnotes about these censorships. In 1864, when Hawthorne was in a funk and feeling ill, William Ticknor took him on a trip south as far as Philadelphia. They intended to go further, but they had a rough time in Philadelphia. Hawthorne was worried that he was dying, and he was cold that night, and Ticknor offered him his coat. Instead, Ticknor caught a cold and died the next morning. Hawthorne was devastated. When he returned to Concord in Massachusetts, he walked from the train station back to his home, the Wayside. His wife described his sudden and surprising appearance. This is a quote from his wife. "As soon as I saw him, I was frightened out of all knowledge of myself. So haggard, so white, so deeply scored with pain and fatigue was his face." Hawthorne had rushed to get it home to his wife, quote, "where he could fling off all care of himself and give way to his feelings pent up and kept back for so long, especially his feelings over Ticknor's death." In other words, she was saying that he broke down crying, which must have been an unusual experience for her to witness. The friendship of Hawthorne and Ticknor was strong enough that Ticknor's daughter Caroline later wrote an entire book about their friendship called Hawthorne and His Publisher in 1913. There were other problems with Ticknor's death, because after the death of Ticknor, James Fields immediately took over the senior role at the publishing house. Fields was essential for giving the identity of the house of Ticknor and Fields as a literary publisher, not just a publisher of books, but of quality literature meant to stand the test of time. Fields also was a bit of an opportunist. After the death of Henry David Thoreau, Fields bought those unsold copies of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack River, tore off the title page, printed a new one with the Ticknor and Fields imprint, and called it a new second edition. It was still the first edition that hadn't sold. But Fields knew good quality literature, and that's why he's backing up Thoreau here. For the most part, anyway. There are a couple of really famous or infamous to history moments where he turned down books that turned out to be pretty famous. There's one by a woman named Louisa May Alcott, for example. But Fields did what he could to seek out and endorse the best of the best. And perhaps that was the undoing of Ticknor and Fields. Fields was charming and likable. He easily made friends. He was himself a poet, which earned the respect of other writers. He was connected with critics and editors like Edwin Percy Whipple, Samuel Goodwich, and Rufus Griswold, each of whom had tremendous standing in early American literature. Fields knew everyone. He helped introduce Herman Melville to Oliver Wendell Holmes and Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example. And reading any of his extant letters is like lending an ear to the latest literary gossip and the best name-dropping of the era. His company was also the first to offer payments to foreign authors in order to print their works, a kindly gesture that was not legally required in the era without international copyright protections for authors. So Fields was paying authors he didn't need to pay, which is nice in a moral sense, but perhaps not so great in a business sense. It still worked out. By 1856, Ticknor and Fields were the official American publishers of Alfred Lord Tennyson, for example, and each edition of Tennyson's work included a quote from a letter from the poet acknowledging that Ticknor and Fields alone were authorized to print his works in the United States. I hope you're seeing that Fields did whatever it took to urge his writers to work hard, sometimes going too far. With Hawthorne in 1863 and 1864, he paid him in advance, suggested a title, and published an announcement of Hawthorne's forthcoming work, all without Hawthorne agreeing. Hawthorne never finished that particular work, and Fields ended up placing the incomplete manuscript on Hawthorne's casket during his funeral, where Fields actually served as a pallbearer. Not long after, Hawthorne's widow, Sophia Peabody, threatened to sue Fields because the company had promised to pay the highest rate of copyright it ever paid, in royalties anyway, and she felt he stiffed her. And that story is just to emphasize that Fields always did what he thought was best for his authors, in the hopes of pushing them, encouraging them. He often did whatever it took to make them happy outside of their writing as well. For Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, for example, he threw parties in his honor and bought him concert tickets. And of course, he kissed up. Quote, "It strikes me, the author of Evangeline," that's Longfellow, "does better and better every time he strikes his lyre." When negative reviews were published, Fields would write to his authors and reassure them that the critic was wrong, and he might even threaten to boycott that critic. His loyalty and his, and I should mention too, another story, one of Longfellow's greatest critics was this guy named Edgar Allan Poe. When Fields saw one of Poe's latest reviews of Longfellow, Fields literally wished that Poe would just die. Not because he really wanted him to die, he was trying to impress Longfellow that, hey, I'm on your side here, I'm on your team. Fields' loyalty and his generous royalties certainly did well for the company in some respects. But these practices also added costs, and the company's superstar authors required more and more money to maintain. The overhead of the business also began to grow between rent rising, purchasing new equipment and supplies, and a growing staff. They also began purchasing copyrights and investing in periodicals, including purchasing the Atlantic Monthly in 1859. With the Atlantic Monthly, they became the first publishers of now famous works like Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, Julia Ward Howe's The Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Edward Everett Hale's story, The Man Without a Country, as well as various works by Charles W. Chestnut, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Bret Harte, and even Mark Twain. But remember, Ticknor had been the main businessman of Ticknor and Fields, and after his death, things began to change. They sold their retail establishment, so it was no longer a bookstore at the end of 1864, and eventually they ended their lease with the building entirely. They moved to Tremont Street and were eventually reorganized as Fields, Osgood and Company after Ticknor's son Howard Ticknor withdrew from the company and a man named James R. Osgood came in as a partner. Fields may have seen that he was now piloting a sinking ship and retired from the firm immediately after New Year's in January 1871. He retired at 53 years old. and he claimed he wanted to focus more on his own writing. The company became James R. Osgood and Company, with neither the names of Ticknor nor Fields associated with it, except in this little note at the bottom that it used to be Ticknor and Fields, or Fields, Osgood and Company. Osgood sold off assets because the company was now in financial difficulty. They moved to Franklin Street to keep the company afloat. And then there was this great Boston fire of November 1872, which stopped kind of at the foot of Old South Meeting House. That fire devastated the city's publishing industry. And that year, Osgood and Company wrote off a financial loss of $48,366.83. Today, I calculate those losses to over $1 million in 1 year. And I think the loss of both Ticknor and Fields also led even to the most loyal of the company's authors to wonder if it was time to move on. The best example, I think, is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Ticknor and Fields had made Longfellow the highest paid poet in American history, enough that he was able to retire from his full-time day job as a professor at Harvard and focus solely on his writing. After 25 or 30 years with the same publisher, by 1874, Longfellow was shopping around for a new publisher. To appease his most popular poet, Osgood nervously offered him a deal, a retainer or annuity, equivalent to $92,000 a year today, even if Longfellow didn't publish a thing that year. Although I think this is both a great deal for Longfellow and an amazing historical point in American publishing, it also smells of desperation on the part of Osgood, who never quite lived up to the predecessors Ticknor and Fields. Eventually, the company merged with Hurd and Houghton to form Houghton, Osgood and Company, which in turn eventually evolved into Houghton Mifflin and then Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which still exists today. The Old Corner Bookstore itself continued selling books until about 1903. After that, the building shifted various retail roles for several decades. In 1960, a group of Bostonians fought to preserve the Old Corner from development. A nonprofit company raised $275,000 to buy the building and restore it, until the Boston Globe assumed responsibility in exchange for a long-term lease until the certain chain restaurant that will not now be named. And there were a couple of other things in between. Regardless of its use, though, even as I say this bitterly somewhat, I, for one, am thankful that the building exists as a reminder of this era that created the American publishing industry as we know it. And that it sits on the Freedom Trail is also a good reminder of the role that literature played in expanding freedom and putting forward radical ideas. And of course, it's now part of the literary heritage of Massachusetts, of Boston. But looking back at this complicated history of a complicated publishing house, ultimately we have to ask, what is the legacy of Ticknor and Fields and its headquarters, the Old Corner Bookstore? In the 19th century, writer George William Curtis referred to the bookstore as the hub of the hub. Others called it the American Parnassus, referencing the Greek mountain that, according to mythology, was home to the Muses. I think there are a few things that make the story of Ticknor and Fields unique. For one, they built up a circle of loyal authors, not just clients for whom they printed works, but partners in a shifting publishing industry where author and publisher both played vital roles in a book's success. They believed in literature more than in profit, and believed that the best authors deserve to be financially compensated for their efforts. That's a concept that very few publishers thought at the time. They also centered New England as the seat of literary and intellectual culture, and their influence in that field is seen in the canon even today, where still most people seem to think all the great literature is in New England in the 19th century. They pushed for a certain type of genteel, morally uplifting type of writing too, and that impacted the industry as a whole and other authors throughout the country, such that the authors that did not write to offer positive life instruction were inevitably unsuccessful. Or, as an article in 1880 summed it all up. The names of Ticknor and Fields are imperishably connected with one of the most brilliant chapters of American literary history, and the Old Corner Bookstore, while those names rested over its doors, must be regarded as the birthplace, commercially speaking, of if not intellectually, of more of the books that have established the American literary name than can be credit to any other spot. And that's all I have.
You were talking about the letters with Fields and sort of the gossip and everything, and I was wondering where you can find those letters today. I wanted to go read them.
Sure. Because Fields was writing to so many people, many of Fields' letters are in so many other people's letters collections. So I found quite a few at Houghton Library, for example, at Harvard. And there's some really good ones there, particularly his letters to Longfellow, which were frequent. And some of the letters that he writes to Hawthorne are still at the New York Public Library. There's some at the Morgan. Basically, Fields is everywhere because Fields was everywhere.
And just another question I had, you were talking about one of the rarest books that's been published. I missed the title of that book.
Tamburlaine and Other Poems.
Okay.
That was 1827, without the name of the author, but the author was Edgar Allan Poe. It was published in Boston, and it's now the rarest and probably the most valuable first edition of any American writer.
Great. Thank you.
Did anybody own one? Did anyone bring one today? Was it any good? Not really, not really. It was 1827.
Was it a common practice for publishers to begin as booksellers? And we sort of think of the two as separate today, but it sounded like they went from a bookstore to a printer to a publisher. Did others do the same thing in this period?
Yes, I think so. I think the concept of publisher was developed by Ticknor and Fields and others in the period, like Harper's. They were a pretty big New York publishing house, or some of the others in Philadelphia, which was also a big publishing hub. So yes, printers were booksellers. Eventually, Ticknor and Fields also creates this massive network with other printers and sellers throughout the country, so that they would send plates or they would send unbound copies of their books and say, okay, you're my Chicago distributor now, or you're my New York distributor now, and so forth. That's really the more modern concept of publishing as we know it, that it's more of a national concept. Before this, we're looking at printers who looked locally. So that's why they were selling their own books. They didn't worry about publishing beyond Boston, for example, or beyond Philadelphia, or beyond New York. Or Hartford was also a big publishing hub for a little while. Ticknor and Fields are really the ones that expand that concept to a more modern concept.
I have a question about Thoreau. I have the impression he was not really wasn't as intimately with those famous writers as the others, and he didn't join their breakfast club at the. My mind is up somewhere
the Parker
today.
House, yeah.
At the
Parker
House Hotel.
Right.
And he said, I don't want to sit there and listen to people talk about how wonderful they are. Is that all true?
So the question is about Thoreau and his connections to all these people we were talking about. For the most part, Thoreau was not a joiner. And I think that's a fair assessment, just to start with that assumption. I don't know if the offer to join the Saturday Club ever came to Thoreau. I imagine it probably did, because they invited everyone they knew at different points. Although the Saturday Club doesn't really kick off the way we know it until after the Civil War, and Mr. Thoreau is gone by then. I think he had a lot more connections than most people give him credit for. He certainly had connections outside of New England. He works with Horace Greeley out of New York, for example. Greeley helps encourage his work and get him published and things like that. Certainly Thoreau was close with Emerson in some ways for a while. Certainly Thoreau was close with Hawthorne at different points. Certainly Thoreau at least knew of Longfellow and visited him at his house and so forth. So he's a lot more connected than I think than most people. He wasn't the hermit of Walden his whole life, basically. But still, yeah, I think he's still a little standoffish, and that's partly because of personality clashes. You're referring to this comment that all they do is talk about how wonderful they all are. That was a very Bostonian thing to do. Margaret Fuller, the critic writer, at one point refers to Boston as a mutual admiration society. There's a great one too, I mentioned very briefly a critic named Edwin Percy Whipple, who was one of the most respected Bostonian critics. And people knew this. It was known that if you were from Boston, Edwin Percy Whipple always gave you a good review. And Ralph Waldo Emerson's son actually writes about that as if it's this wonderful, brilliant, kind thing to do. In the 21st century, we're all like, why are you hooking up only your friends, you know? But that's sort of the culture of the Boston literati.
So you mentioned Julia Ward Howe, and maybe Caroline Ticknor or someone in passing, but you really haven't focused on the women who were published through either the Ticknor and Fields operation or one of their subsequent manifestations.
Sure.
Talk about that a little bit, because it seems like either they're overlooked for a while, but today they're among the most renowned to come out of that era.
Yeah, so the question is about the women involved in this publishing world, and Ticknor and Fields is connected with them. The Boston literati was very white and very masculine. That's part of it. There certainly were women authors, but they were not as well respected. There's a great quote from Hawthorne. You're familiar with a book called The Lamplighter, which was one of the best-selling novels of the 1850s, I think it was. And when Hawthorne sees this book, he writes to either Ticknor or Fields, I think it's Ticknor, and basically says that I'm tired of these women authors, this damned mob of scribbling women. Hawthorne, in part, is jealous of that success because he thinks he's the real author. Who are these women trying to usurp my audience? He also adds a caveat to that letter about a week later. He writes back to Ticknor and says, you know that comment about scribbling women? I have one exception, and that is Fanny Fern. I had to say it. Fanny Fern, the author of Ruth Hall in 1854. She writes as if the devil is in her, which is the only way in which a woman should write. That's what Hawthorne says. Yeah, I think it takes a little longer for the women authors to get the respect, even as they were getting the sales. Eventually, a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe becomes a Ticknor and Fields author. So they are there. They just don't necessarily stand out, particularly in the 1850s.
I just wanted to clarify the quote about, was it Fields saying, I wish Poe would just die? Was that during the Longfellow War? And I know Longfellow didn't respond technically. Was it Fields that got involved, I'm sure?
Yes, it's during what's called the Little Longfellow War, in which Poe writes essentially a series of attacks on Longfellow's writing that was partially, I think, a PR stunt more than anything else, but also trying to get down to a basic question of what is American literature. Should it be moral and didactic? Should it be entertaining? Should it be art for the sake of art? Or should it be something more than that? Fields, of course, is going to back up Longfellow, and he actually makes a vow that he'll never publish anything by Edgar Allan Poe, and Fields never does. He stays true to that. He never once publishes anything by Edgar Allan Poe. James Osgood does, because it takes a little longer for Poe to get the respect and popularity that he has today. James Osgood did put out an edition of Poe's works, so sorry, Fields. The quote was something along the lines of, I was sorry to hear that, he had been sick, Poe had been sick, and I'm sorry to hear he wasn't as sick as I hoped he was. But it was more of an expression of his loyalty to Longfellow. For his part, Longfellow didn't seem that bothered by the Little Longfellow War that Poe had started. There's really no response of any significance from Longfellow at all. There's a little diary entry that he makes where he damns censorious Poe, and that's as much as Longfellow ever does. And of course, when Poe predeceases him in 1849, Longfellow writes all these amazing complimentary things about Poe, so he looks like the bigger man in all of this. Sorry.
Could you comment a little on the portrayal of Ticknor and Fields in Matthew Pearl's The Dante Club? Because it does play quite a bit. I'm just curious how accurate you feel that would be.
It's a great question. It's been a little while since Matthew Pearl published The Dante Club. Any of you familiar with The Dante Club? I hope he's really working on the sequel he once mentioned. I think it's really authentic, actually. I think his portrayal of all those characters seems to line up pretty well with my understanding of all those characters, with one exception. One of the main characters was Oliver Wendell Holmes. I'm sorry, Matthew. Holmes is depicted as being a little squeamish when he sees a couple corpses, and I think he vomits at one point because it's so disgusting and horrifying. But Oliver Wendell Holmes was a medical doctor who taught anatomy and physiology by cutting open cadavers in front of people at Harvard. I don't think he was anywhere near as squeamish as Matthew wants him to be. But Fields plays a really great role in that book too, sort of bringing that group together and sort of is at the center of all of their connections too. And I think at the end, I think it's Fields who ends up with the bag of money, which is also very Fields-like, I think. I don't remember where the money came from, but it's at the end of the book.
And I'll try and speak a little bit louder. So I missed Lynn Hyde's talk about the Peabody Bookshop, and I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about that, if it was existing at the same time, if they were communicating with one another.
Sure. She's asking about Elizabeth Peabody's bookshop that Lynn Hyde spoke about, and I am not the expert. I'm really not. I want to say that the Peabody Bookstore was a little earlier than the American Renaissance, right? We're talking about 1830s and 40s. And although Ticknor and Fields are there, and they're pretty close. It was at West Street, right? So they're pretty close. That was more of a lending library and focused on foreign books. At the time that Ticknor and Fields is publishing, most of what they're selling, again, this is early in their imprint, a lot of the stuff that they're selling is not high quality literature. So there's a lot of religious pamphlets, there's a lot of juvenile writing for kids. There's stuff about the natural history of fishes of Massachusetts with a really good graphic for whatever year that is, 1843, I guess. Yeah, so it takes a little while before Ticknor and Fields become Ticknor and Fields. Right. So, and of course this is, well, I don't want to go too far into that. Lynn will tell you a lot more about it, I'm sure, right?
And I was also just wondering, what year was the fire that you were talking about in November of what year?
The Boston Fire, what year was it? 1872. There's a little bit of information about it at the back of the meeting house here, actually, in one of the exhibit cases.
Thank you.
All right, well, once again, thank you.
Okay.
I definitely learned a lot, which is cool.
Me too. Thanks, everyone.